There's this moment, standing in line behind the rows of other students in their blue gowns and stiff caps, where you're supposed to feel like all the struggle was worth it, like you're on the edge of some bright new chapter and your people are right there, clapping so loud they drown out every doubt that kept you up at night. That's what I'd pictured when I ordered my cap and gown months ago, the image I clung to when I stayed up past midnight writing papers he'd said would never matter in the real world. I kept glancing up at the bleachers as our row crept forward. My mother was easy to spot, she always was, that neon green scarf she wore like a banner so I'd never lose her in a crowd. She waved the second she caught my eye, beaming so wide her cheeks practically lifted her glasses. But the seat next to her, the one I'd asked her to save for him, was still empty. A gap that felt bigger than the sea of people around us. I told myself he'd come rushing in at the last second, some excuse about traffic or the office, something he'd mutter under his breath as he settled in, avoiding my mother's glare. But when they called my name, when the principal's voice boomed through the cheap mic, mispronouncing my middle name just like he did at orientation, that seat stayed empty. I felt the cheer in my throat die on the way out. I smiled anyway, because what else can you do when you've worked 4 years for a handshake and a slip of paper you're not sure you'll ever hang on a wall? I caught my mother's eyes as I crossed the stage. She was crying, half from pride, half from the way she knew I'd feel the empty seat more than the applause. I took my diploma from the dean with both hands, my fingers pressing so hard into the fake leather cover I thought I'd leave permanent dents. They told us to pause in the middle for photos, one bright flash to prove we'd made it, no matter how shaky our belief in ourselves felt under the heavy fabric of the gown. I looked right at that empty seat when the camera clicked. Maybe that was petty. Maybe that was just me trying to etch the truth into something permanent, the truth that he wasn't there because he chose not to be, not because he couldn't. And the truth that some absences weigh more than a stadium full of cheers. After the ceremony, people spilled out onto the sunlit lawn like they'd been set free. Classmates posed with families, fathers holding up signs that read "My baby did it," like they'd written every essay with them, like they'd stayed up all night editing drafts, like they'd been there for every meltdown and coffee-fueled breakthrough. I stood to the side, hugging my mother, her small frame tucked into my cap and gown. I felt her trying to hold me together with her arms, as if her pride could patch the hole he left behind. "Maybe he got caught up at work," she said, voice gentle, careful not to let the anger slip through. "Maybe he'll be waiting at home with something special." I nodded because I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly to believe that the man who'd once read me bedtime stories, who'd sat in the front row of every piano recital when I was little, hadn't turned into the father who thought my brother's errands were more important than this one moment I couldn't do over. I clutched that diploma so tightly on the drive home that my fingers ached. I told myself maybe there'd be a card waiting, or a hug, or some rough apology about a meeting that ran late. But under it all, I already knew. I could feel it in my bones, the same way you feel rain coming even when the sky's still blue. Some things don't change, no matter how much you want them to. And some empty seats say more than any speech ever could. It was almost dusk by the time we pulled into the driveway. My mother's old sedan rattled up the cracked pavement, the trunk still stuffed with the flowers my aunt had given me, half wilted now, leaning against the edge of my graduation cap like they were bowing in defeat. I remember the sky being the soft kind of purple you wish you could wrap yourself in, warm and forgiving. But inside me, everything felt raw and cold. From the road, I could see the shape of it before I saw him. Something sleek and shiny, a gleaming dark blue that caught the last of the sunlight like a mirror. At first, I thought maybe he'd rented something fancy for the celebration he hadn't made it to. Some part of me, even after sitting through the entire ceremony without him, still wanted to believe he'd found another way to say, "I'm proud of you." But then I saw my brother leaning against the hood, all smug grin and crossed arms, tossing a new key ring up and down in his hand like he was practicing for some bad movie scene. And there he was too, my father, standing beside him, beaming that wide, warm smile that he used to save for me when I was the one bringing home certificates taped to the fridge. They didn't see us pull in right away. They were too busy admiring the glossy paint job, the big red bow still half stuck to the windshield like an afterthought. My mother's hand tightened on the steering wheel, so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't say a word as she parked. She just sat there a second longer than she had to, her eyes locked on the two of them, her lips pressed thin like she was trying to hold something back that would slip out too sharp if she let it go. I stepped out first, the hem of my gown still clinging to my calves because I hadn't had the energy to change out of it yet. It felt ridiculous, standing there in a cap and gown, diploma case tucked under my arm, while my brother laughed about horsepower and leather seats and how good it'd look when he pulled up to his friends' parties. My father noticed me then. His smile slipped just a fraction, but not enough to cover the shine in his eyes when he looked at the car again. He patted my brother's shoulder, said something I couldn't hear but knew by heart anyway, "You earned this, son. You deserve it." My brother didn't even bother to hide his smirk when he glanced my way. He twirled the keys around his finger, the tiny metal glint catching the last of the sun. "Hey, congrats on the diploma," he said lazily, like he'd just remembered it happened. "Big day for you too, huh?" "Too." As if we'd both walked across the same stage, but he'd stepped into a future lined with his father's pride, and I'd stepped right back into the shadows. I looked at my father, searching for anything, a sign of regret, a hint that maybe he understood what he'd done. But he just shrugged, like it was nothing. Like it was normal that my brother's car keys weighed more than my entire degree. "You know how it is," he said finally, the words casual, almost kind. He needed something reliable. A car's important when you're starting out. You're gonna do great things too, kiddo. You always do. He clapped my shoulder, the same way you'd pat a coworker you barely knew. Then he turned back to my brother, who was already sliding into the driver's seat, revving the engine just to hear it purr. The bow fluttered off the hood, landing at my feet like some sad, bright reminder that the celebration was never meant for me. Inside the house later, I tucked my diploma into a drawer I hadn't opened in years. I ran my thumb over my name in gold letters, the date that should have been about me. But out in the driveway, I could still hear the engine roar, the gravel crunching under tires my father paid for while my seat stayed empty. That was the day I realized pride can't be bought. And love, the kind I wanted so badly from him, couldn't be either. It's strange, the way people who hurt you can twist it so you're the one who feels guilty for bleeding. I learned that the night I tried to ask him why. Not the half-joking why my mother whispered as she poured herself another cup of coffee that evening, her eyes flicking between my father's stony face and the window where my brother's new car sat like a smug monument to his golden boy status. No, I wanted the real answer. The one that might explain how the man who once taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels couldn't sit through a 2-hour ceremony for the degree he'd spent my entire childhood telling me would never amount to much. Dinner was quiet except for my brother bragging about the car. How smooth it drove. How the sound system made his old clunker look like a joke. I pushed peas around my plate, my diploma case resting on the counter behind me like a ghost. No one asked if I wanted to talk about my day. No one asked what it felt like to stand on that stage alone. When my brother finally drifted off to meet his friends, his new keys dangling from his pocket like some cheap crown, my father leaned back in his chair with that tired sigh I'd heard 1,000 times before. He rubbed his temples like the weight of this family was somehow pressing only on him. I waited until my mother had retreated to the sink to rinse the dishes before I asked. My voice was quiet but steady. "Dad, why didn't you come today?" He looked at me like I'd asked him to explain the weather. He shrugged once, like it was so obvious it didn't deserve more than that. "I had a lot going on, sweetheart. You know that. Work's been tight lately. I had to handle the paperwork for the dealership. Your brother needs that car, you know how unreliable his old one was." I nodded because that's what he expected. But something cracked inside me then, because the lie wasn't even creative. It was the same story he'd spun since I was old enough to understand that sometimes your worth depends on who needs you more. My brother always needed him. I just managed myself. But you said you'd come, I pressed, my fingers knotting together under the table. You promised. You told me last week you'd be there. He let out a soft laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. More like a dismissive exhale. You're making this bigger than it is. Don't be so dramatic. I'm proud of you, you know that. You always do so well. It's just a ceremony. A piece of paper. Your brother needed a new start, that's all this was. That's all this was. A new start for him, on the day that was supposed to be my fresh start. I tried to imagine him standing at that dealership lot, signing the paperwork, the bow on the hood like some final, pretty nail in the coffin of my moment. Did he think of me while he did it? Did he picture me walking across that stage alone, searching for his face in the crowd that would never turn up? When I didn't say anything, he softened his tone like that would fix it. You always want things to be fair, kiddo. Life's not fair. You're strong, you don't need things like he does. He's never been like you. You've always been fine on your own. You don't have to make this a big thing. We're family. That's what matters. Family. That word, again, like it was a magic trick that made betrayal disappear if you just repeated it enough. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw that same shrug in his eyes. That resignation that told me he'd never see the problem, because he'd never see me the way he saw my brother. When I went to bed that night, the engine of my brother's new car rumbled through the open window. I lay awake listening to it fade down the street, wondering if my father heard it too, and if he even realized it was the sound of him driving away from me. It's funny how the smallest things hold the biggest truths when you're finally ready to see them. 2 days after that dinner, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor of my old bedroom, the walls still the same faded lilac I painted when I was 15 and trying to feel like I owned at least one thing in this house. The diploma was propped on my desk like an apology I hadn't asked for. But the real apology, I knew by then, would never come from him. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first. Maybe a receipt, an old note, some scrap of proof that he'd cared the way he said he did. Instead, I opened the drawer under my bed and pulled out the battered shoebox I hadn't touched since high school. It was the kind of box you swear you'll throw out during spring cleaning but always end up pushing further back, like your heart knows it's safer hidden. Inside were the old letters. Most were from my mother's side, my grandma's neat cursive, always a little slanted, always beginning with my brave girl. There were postcards from my aunt, the one who called every semester to remind me how proud she was, even if she was too far away to clap from the stands. And there were the little notes my mom had slipped into my lunch bag when I was a kid. Good luck on your test. Love you more than sunshine. I sat there reading them until the paper felt soft as cloth in my hands. The house was quiet except for the muffled thump of my brother's music outside, his car door slamming shut every so often like a cruel drumbeat to remind me exactly where Dad's pride parked itself these days. I turned one of my grandma's letters over, tracing the way she'd signed it with a heart instead of a dot over the I. She'd written that the year before she passed, after she'd come to my middle school play and sat through an entire 3 hours of squeaky dialogue and forgotten lines just to stand by the stage door with a single daisy and say, "You're the star, honey, you always were." I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tear hit the page. Not big, shattering sobs, just those silent drops that slip out when you're too tired to hold them in any longer. All I could think was how she'd shown up for things that barely even mattered, while he hadn't bothered to show up for the one thing that did. In the bottom of the box was the first award I'd ever won, a tiny, cracked trophy from the elementary spelling bee. I could still hear my dad's voice from that day, half proud, half mocking. "That's nice, kiddo, but you know no one cares how you spell chrysanthemum in the real world." He'd laughed and ruffled my hair, the same way he laughed when I told him I'd been accepted to college, saying, "Just don't expect me to pay for you to sit around reading books all day." He'd always made me feel like wanting more than this house, more than his approval, was selfish. But there, on my bedroom floor, surrounded by letters from people who'd seen me for who I really was, I realized wanting more had never been the problem. Hoping he'd give it, that was. I put the letters back one by one, careful with the corners that had grown soft with time. I pressed my palm against the lid, grounding myself with the weight of every word they'd written to me. Those scraps of paper held more than he ever would: belief, pride, love without strings. Downstairs, I heard my father's laugh through the open window, drifting in with the smell of exhaust and grass. I knew then I couldn't make him proud the way my brother did, no matter what I did or how hard I worked. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Because for the first time, I felt the truth. I'd rather have a shoebox full of old letters that said "I see you" than a driveway full of empty gestures meant for someone else. Sometimes people think taking a stand has to be loud, slammed doors, shouted threats, big public scenes where you storm out with a suitcase in one hand and your dignity in the other. But that's not how it happened for me. My stand started small, in the way I stopped telling him things he didn't deserve to know. I didn't announce my plans at dinner. I didn't fight with him in the hallway like my mother always did when he spent money on my brother's whims and called it an investment. I just made my choices in the quiet moments, the ones he never thought to pay attention to. It started with the internship. The one he'd laughed at months ago, saying, "Non-profits don't pay the bills. Why waste your time with people who can't help you get ahead?" Back then, I'd let his words sink in, heavy and sticky like wet clay, weighing down the part of me that wanted to help people more than I wanted to show him my paycheck. But after the empty seat at my graduation, the car with the bow, the excuses that turned my pride into a footnote in his day, I realized there was nothing left to prove to him anyway. So I called the director of that tiny community program, the one that ran out of an old church basement and offered food assistance and tutoring for kids whose fathers never bothered to show up either. I told her I wanted the spot, that I'd work weekends, that I didn't need a stipend if she didn't have one yet. Her voice cracked with relief when she said, "We'd love to have you." I knew you were the right fit. That single yes, so different from his dismissive nods and half-hearted "we'll see" replies, felt like someone had unlocked a window I hadn't realized was bolted shut. I could breathe again. I didn't tell him when I got the official letter. I pinned it on my bedroom corkboard next to my diploma instead, my private monument to the version of me he never really wanted to know. When my brother found out, he laughed, of course. He leaned against his shiny new car like it was his throne, jingling his keys. "That's cute. Helping the poor and whatnot. You're gonna be the broke one forever, huh?" I didn't rise to it. I didn't need to. His words bounced right off the letters my grandmother wrote me, the ones that said "You're the strong one. You'll never settle for scraps." Money, his new car, the smug grin, they were all bricks in the wall I was climbing over, one careful foothold at a time. The day I moved out, I didn't slam the door. I didn't wait for him to come home so he could pretend to care enough to stop me. I packed my mother's old suitcase with the things that actually felt like mine, the quilt my aunt made me for my dorm bed, my college notebooks filled with margin doodles and tiny dreams, the letters, always the letters. My mother stood in the hallway, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes shining with something like pride but also something like apology. We didn't speak it out loud. We didn't need to. Outside, I tossed my bag into my second-hand hatchback, the one I'd paid for with 3 years of retail paychecks he called pocket money. I looked at my brother's car parked next to mine, gleaming like an empty promise. I didn't feel envy anymore. Just distance, the kind that frees you. When I pulled out of the driveway, the house looked smaller than it ever had. The garden needed weeding, the shutters were chipped, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the space I'd carved out for myself. My own choices. My own money. My own mistakes and victories, and every inch of the future he'd never get to take credit for. I didn't need his applause anymore. I never did. It's strange how you can measure freedom in miles. I didn't realize it until I was halfway down the back road that snakes behind my old high school, the same road my father used to drive me down when I was just a kid in the passenger seat, knees pressed to my chest, backpack wedged between my feet. He'd tap the steering wheel, humming along to the radio, telling me the future was waiting if I worked hard enough, but I'd always have him in my corner. I think that was the first promise he broke, the one I clung to longest. Now I was the one behind the wheel, my hand draped over the gearshift, my mother's battered suitcase rattling in the trunk. My car was nothing special, a faded hatchback with squeaky brakes and a cassette player that ate half my tapes. But it was mine. Every oil change, every insurance payment, every late-night drive when I needed to remind myself I could move, even when he made me feel like I was stuck. The internship turned into a job, the job turned into a stepping stone. Nobody clapped for me when I got the letter confirming my promotion. There was no big dinner, no surprise cake or shiny new keys waiting in the driveway. But when I walked into my tiny apartment that night, the letter crumpled from me clutching it in my pocket all day. I pinned it up next to my diploma, both of them glowing in the cheap lamplight like a quiet testament to who I'd always been. Sometimes people asked about my father when I told them bits and pieces of my story. Did he ever apologize? Does he know how well you're doing now? I'd just smile and shake my head. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd call sometimes when my brother needed help paying off the car, or when he thought he could still barter a little piece of my forgiveness if he dangled some leftover praise in front of me. I'd listen politely, the way you do when you're talking to a stranger who thinks they still know you. But the truth was, I didn't need the apology anymore. I didn't want the bow on a cheap, last-minute gift. The empty seat at my graduation, the empty words that followed, they'd taught me more than he ever did about the kind of love that matters. The people who showed up, they were the ones I carried with me. My mother, who tucked $50 into my lunch bag when she knew I was too proud to ask for it. My aunt and her postcards that always smelled like salt air and freedom. My grandmother, whose careful letters sat in a shoebox on my closet shelf, still smelling faintly of old perfume and ink that bled through the pages when I cried into them too many times to count. One day, I found myself driving past the old house. The garden was overgrown, the paint was peeling around the windows, and my brother's shiny new car was nowhere in sight, probably long traded in, like most of the promises my father made. I didn't feel the pull I thought I would. No grief, no anger, just a soft exhale of gratitude for the girl who finally packed up and left before she could be rooted there forever. When I got back to my apartment that night, I ran my fingers over my name on that diploma, over the pinned letters, over the wrinkled offer for the new job I'd earned without him. And I realized that every seat he'd left empty, I'd filled myself. They say you're supposed to have someone proud of you when you cross your finish line. But what they don't tell you is, you can stand there alone and still feel whole. Sometimes you are your own witness, your own loudest cheer, your own unwavering, stubborn proof that you don't need someone else to clap when you've learned to clap for yourself. And when I turned out the light, I knew this was my road, chipped paint, squeaky brakes, no bow on the hood, and I'd never trade it for his kind of love.